البرزنتيشن اتفضل معانا البرزنتيشن دكتور عمر. كان برزنتيشن ان شاء الله عن الرياضه للجميع مع اهداف وربطها باهداف التنميه المستدامه.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very, very delighted to be with you here today.
في سماعات موجوده للعرض.
And all protocol respected, I'm very honoured to be among your distinguished presenters, guests and hosts. Clearly the importance of sport in this country, in the region and internationally is very, very clear. And I think the various different dimensions in which you're treating the area of sport for all is also very evident. A wide array of, be it from a health perspective, social inclusion, economic, business perspective, all the various different aspects that sport can contribute to in our societies, I think have been very well addressed by the speakers before me today. So, from my perspective, I'm going to speak about sport for all and the connection with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm conscious that this was already mentioned as a priority of the Federation. So we just have a look at how that's been embraced by the international community and how I suppose the ask is of all of us to look at how sport can feed into the different dimensions of sustainable development and the importance being placed on that agenda from an international level and indeed looking regionally as well. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So the Sustainable Development Goals come from this document called Transforming Our World. And sometimes when we think about the goals, we think about the 17 iconic images that we now have come to know as the Sustainable Development Goals. But the document that set out the goals is entitled Transforming Our World. And that's a big agenda. So how do we transform our world? And one of the mechanisms used to do that is looking at the intersection of the 17 goals and targets. But it is a big agenda, Agenda 2030, as it's otherwise known, and it's underpinned by international law and the Charter of the United Nations. So a very big agenda, and it is still the biggest ever negotiated charter by the United Nations. So this document was not just produced and countries signed up to it, it was negotiated and agreed and debated and deliberated and then accepted by 195 countries, as this is a really good solid framework and solution for us to address our development needs globally. It's grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international human rights mechanisms. And in terms of sport and how sport progresses and develops, and indeed the concept of sport for all, this connection between sustainable development and human rights is critically important. And with the association and the focus of this conference in that sport for all frame, it brings that human rights underpinnings even more important. Next slide. And we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So the goals apply to every nation and every sector, including sport. And those of you who are familiar with the goals, you might recognize that none of the individual goals or indeed targets explicitly reference sport. It's referenced in the declaration, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the goals apply to every nation and every sector, including sport, and they call on all of us to do what we can to act to advance the goals. So whether you're coming from the perspective of government or a city or a business or schools or universities, everybody's asked to take whatever action they can to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. So in that respect, they're called universal. Next slide, please. They're interconnected. So when you make progress on one goal, it often impacts on another goal, which is great in a way. And what this has done for sport is it's given us a new language to say that if we advance something in one dimension of sport, it can impact upon sustainable communities, it can impact upon our good health and well-being, it impacts upon education. So it gives us a new way to frame and to discuss sport, and indeed to share the impact that sport has in areas that others might not have considered beyond sport. So it gives us a new language to talk about sport. It does call for the goals, and Agenda 2030 call for very big, fundamental changes in how we live on Earth. So it's addressing the biggest challenges that we face and asking us to change our systems, change our practices, so as we can change what we do and how we do it to benefit countries, individuals and sectors of our societies more. So it is asking for us to do things in a very different way to what we've done in the past, and to really transform how we live for the betterment of everybody and the planet and our economies and societies as well. So these are the goals that you might be familiar with, and as I mentioned, they're all interconnected, interrelated, and sometimes when you take action on one, it impacts another, and vice versa. But it does, from a sporting context, it has really brought into play a brand new language and a way of discussing sport that was never, I suppose, enabled in the past. And I know from discussions we've had with many sports ministries around the world, what they've said to us is when we talk about sport in the context of sustainable development goals, other ministries listen to us in a way that they really didn't listen to us in the past, because we can set the importance of sport in the context of reduced inequalities, gender equality, industry innovation and infrastructure, lots of different ways to explore and illustrate the power and the impact of sport across areas that many of us involved in sport can already know and already understand, but people coming from beyond a sport environment might not appreciate. So it is a new language that enables us to really set out the value of sport. So this is paragraph 37. So I mentioned sport is not in the individual goals and targets. It's in the declaration which precedes the goals and targets in Agenda 2030. And this is the specific paragraph that references it. And the paragraphs in the declaration carry as much weight and importance as any of the individual goals and targets. And it's really important to remember that when we're advocating for sport as part of the solution for sustainable development. It's an important enabler, and we recognise the growing contribution of sport to the realisation of development and peace, the promotion of tolerance and respect, and the contribution to the empowerment of women, young people, individuals, communities, and to health, education and social inclusion, and indeed to many of the other integrated areas that sport connects with. So, I mentioned the human rights connection before, and when you look at the concept of sport for all, and it being for everybody in our societies, it's really important that we look at then the kind of human rights alignment with the Sustainable Development Agenda as well. And when we looked at the indicators for sustainable development and sport, and we looked at the indicators relating to human rights implementation, we found there's a 92% overlap in the indicators for sport for development and the indicators relating to human rights. So a huge correlation between those initiatives. And that goes for sport, physical education, physical activity, adaptive physical activity, adaptive physical education, etc. So that connection between the two is really important. And what that brings as well is when we're doing our reporting in relation to how does sport contribute to sustainable development, the same reporting can be used to report to international human rights treaties and indeed to regional human rights treaties and mechanisms that we have. So I appreciate you cannot see the bottom of the screen here, but it's looking at the policy coherence. So what I'm just talking about on this slide is the range of international policies that have been established since 2015 that absolutely highlight as a policy priority meeting the requirements of the Sustainable Development Goals or advancing the Sustainable Development Goals through our work in sport. So calling on us to look at our sport differently in terms of how it connects in with sustainable development agendas and using the big mechanisms we now have in sport and the massive opportunity that sport presents to us to advance our societies and communities for everyone. So WHO's Global Action Plan on Physical Activity was one of the first documents out to look at commissioning our greatest effort at those who have been the least active, or the opportunity to be, who have had the least opportunity to be active. So this came out of the WHO Global Action Plan. UNESCO's Kazan Action Plan called on us as a policy priority as well, from the World Conference of Sports Ministers in 2017, to advance sustainable development and to prioritise inclusion and inclusive actions in sport. The 2030 agenda itself and mechanisms that followed on from that for the global sport community looked at establishing mechanisms for measuring the contribution of sport to sustainable development, and those measurement mechanisms have been put in place now. So we can look at sport with the lens of indicators particularly related to sport and its connection with sustainable development. Human Rights Council looked at promoting human rights through sport and the Olympic ideal, and again held a symposium at the Social Forum on the possibility of using sport to promote human rights for all and strengthening universal respect for them. The UN General Assembly had a resolution on sport as an enabler of sustainable development, and the United Nations Action Plan on Sport for Development and Peace also looked at the importance of sustainable development. So that's the international policy context. And what we've seen since 2017, 2018, 2019 is that regional sport policies, federation-based policies, country-based policies, and even local sports organisations now are looking to how their sport can contribute and what human rights are at play when we engage in sport as well, and how do we ensure that we meet those who have difficulty, I suppose, accessing their human rights in and through sport. So from a human rights perspective then, the three core messages are that everyone has a right to participate, and that's central to the mission of Sport for All. Sport at all levels must protect human rights, including child protection, provisions against harassment and violence. And sport can promote human rights, such as equality, employment, education, health for all. So sport does not stand on its own as a right to participate, but it contributes. Sometimes by being involved in sport, you get to be involved in other aspects of community life. You might get to engage in education at a level that you didn't in the past, and improve access to health as well. So sport and rights interconnect, just like the Sustainable Development Goals interconnect. And what we know about the goals is they are designed to advance development for people, for prosperity, for peace, partnership and planet. And the partnership message is very important here too. It's about coming together differently with different organisations, maybe with different government departments, with different segments of the community. You mentioned business sector, entrepreneurship, health sector, looking at how we can work together. And I think these 11 areas the Minister spoke of earlier, sport for health, sport for development, looking at those ways in which we can advance sport being critically important. I seem to be stuck on this slide. So for the goals to be reached, everyone needs to do their part. So it goes on governments, the private sector, universities, civil society, and individuals to work together to try and advance the goals. And in a sporting context, whether you're working at the ministry, whether you're working in a business or in a university, or you're volunteering in a sport club, how can you take what the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Human Rights Agenda is asking of us and apply something in whatever way you have responsibility for to make sure that into the future sport can do things better for everyone and produce better outcomes and better results. And that's another difference that we've seen in the last few years, is the emphasis on measurement of outcomes. So while we have invested in sport quite substantially over the last few decades, and at an increasing level across governments and across society, what we want to do now is try and measure the impact of that investment from an outcomes perspective. So what are the tangible outcomes that we can see? Is it better health? Is it better social inclusion? What tangible outputs can we see from our investment in sport, and how can we measure that effectively to make a case for investment and increased prioritisation of sport. While it's very clear for me here at this forum that sport is held in such high esteem and high regard, it's not necessarily that way in all parts of the world, and sometimes governments have to make a very strong case to get a very small slice of the pie to invest in sport. So we do believe that by showing evidence that investment in sport delivers in many different ways, we can increase the case for investment in sport that will benefit people in their communities and in their societies in the multiple ways that we say. The illustration on the top left corner is just about those agencies working together, so coming together, having partnerships between government, industry, civil society, academia, working collectively, bringing the research to the policymakers, and vice versa. So having those relationships so that we can really understand how best to get value for our investments in sport and how to maximise that for all people in our societies and communities. A key principle of the Sustainable Development Goals is leave no one behind. So this is, again, another critically important message. So if we continue to invest in sport, and there's lots of good things happening, new infrastructure in place, new teams coming together, new opportunities, new careers, new professionals, new university programs, are we making sure in that development and advancement that we are leaving no one behind? Because if there are segments of our communities and societies who are not at the table, who don't have the opportunity to participate as readily as others, then can we really say we're developing? So one of the principles of the goals that they have aspired to be addressed in the early years of the goals from 2015 to 2030 is the concept of looking at who finds it hard to participate in sport right now, and how do we make sure that those people can access sport and that we can overcome the barriers that make it difficult for them and maybe their families to get them involved in sport. So how do we make sure that as we advance and progress and professionalise sport more, nobody's getting left behind? So the goals as well are three levels and layers to the goals, and again interconnected. So looking at the impact on our biosphere, our environment. We mentioned the Red Sea, the various different areas of the coast and the coastal Ironman, and lots of impact that sport can have on our environment, and looking at how we can impact that environment in a positive way, what we can give back from sport, I suppose, to the environment as well, and then looking at the societal benefits of sport. So many of the goals across low poverty, sustainable cities and communities, strong institutions, and that's building in your human rights mechanisms, clean energy, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, and zero hunger, all of the societal goals that connect with sport, and then we have our economic areas. So creating decent work and economic growth through sport. We've seen a proliferation of new careers, new professionals, new enterprises in sport. And again, that links to industry innovation. You spoke of bikes. I mean, that's a huge industry now, and a very solid industry from the point of the return investment to the economy. Reducing inequalities being an economic impact. So rather than have the burden of inequality leaving some people out of participation in society, there are huge economic benefits for making sure that everyone can be included and contributing to society. Responsible consumption and production being another one, again one that the sports sector can look at favourably in terms of how it's contributing to that. And partnerships and the goals at the top, the importance of working collaboratively and working collectively. Okay, so some key things just before, and I know I won't go on too much longer, I know that time is tight. But the role of sport for all in building a person, I think these are the themes of your conference for the coming days. So what I was just going to do is do a very brief alignment of these themes with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I will be very brief because I'm sure the slides can be shared with you all, so I'm not going to labour on them. I'll just flick through them, and when you get the slides, you can look at them in your own time. So these are the themes of the conference, and basically what I've included here on the right-hand side is how the theme for the conference connects with the various different human rights areas or charters and policy in international sport. I'm not going to go through them in detail because I'm very conscious of the time, but as I said, they will be shared with you and you'll be able to have that then for your own reference. So that's looking at theme 1, theme 2 again,
return to countries. And again, here we have a lot of evidence and resources that have been developed internationally around this connection. Thirdly, looking at building codes for roads and cities, and Sport for All. And again, we have some examples here from the International Transport Forum Summit around this agenda. Lots of resources there that you can draw on to address this area. Looking at reducing medical spending in countries and good health and wellbeing SDG. We have huge areas there to cover across NCDs and mental health as well. I think mental health was mentioned earlier, and again, sometimes an area that gets ignored. The role of sports institutions in supporting sport for all, and we've got some indicators there. I think I've been through that one in detail. These are the national equality, you have national legislation, these are the international human rights, I suppose, not necessarily legislation, but charters and instruments that point to the lead for sport for all since 1948. But what we've seen since the Sustainable Development Goals have come on stream is increased importance and emphasis on the human rights connection. Sport for all and persons with disabilities, and in 2020 we saw the first global physical activity guidelines for persons with disabilities, and I think that's a marker to really eradicate any myths around the benefit of physical activity for people with disabilities and move forward. Sport for all and its impact on tourism, and we've got some resources here that you can link to. And finally then, I think we're at number 9, application of models in society. So we're able to move the dial over to the transformative end of this and reach the furthest behind. So while there's goodwill and a range of approaches, it's critically important that we reach the furthest behind first as we progress. And as I said, we will share the slides with you so you'll be able to go through what I flicked through very quickly there in greater detail in your own time. So thank you very much.